at the top, built on the bones of the tomb. Older earth unlimited, chambers everlocked, a shadow that's kissed by the moon. Take a leap of faith to follow free. The Nile runs red tonight, smelling like a wound into the sea. The Nile runs red
$300,000 years ago, Homo sapien extraterrestrial gold miners from the planet Nibiru adapted their genome to Earth. They added genes from Homo erectus, and mitochondrial DNA from their wombs, to make us, a worker race, to slave for them. Our very existence, our life itself, comprises the most precious asset they bestowed on us. After the deluge of 13,000 years ago, the gods, as the Nibirans had us call them, gave us the assets we call civilization in ancient Sumer, Turkey and Iraq. Anunnaki Goldmining Expedition leaders ruled us through the grandsons of their Chief Scientist Enki's son, Ziusudra, Noah, and his sons, Shem, Japhet, and Ham and their descendants. Our ancestors and the Anunnaki together renewed agriculture and animal husbandry with genetic starts Enki had buried in a diorite vault in Iraq. The Anunnaki and we built dams and drained floodwaters into rivers for Sumer, reclaimed the Nile Basin, and spread civilization over the entire Earth. Together, we built a new spaceport on the Sinai Peninsula. Based on numerous archaeological discoveries, artifacts, records, and monuments found in the past by experts, it is believed that the Anunnaki, Sumerian, those who came down from the heavens, an extremely advanced civilization from an elusive planet in our solar system, came to Earth, landing in the Persian Gulf some 432,000 years ago. In the last couple of decades, numerous controversial discoveries have been made which challenge mainstream researchers and their views on history and human evolution. Every time we write about the ancient Anunnaki, we come across much discomfort from various sides of readers. While there are those who firmly believe the existence of the Anunnaki, and their arrival to Earth can explain many accounts which mainstream scholars cannot, there are those who believe that the ancient Anunnaki never existed, and that extremely advanced civilizations never existed on Earth. However, in the last couple of years, a lot of researchers are changing their methodology and starting to think open-mindedly. The ancient alien astronaut theory presupposes that thousands of years ago, even before recorded history, our planet was visited by astronauts from another world, intelligent beings with technology beyond our own today. Many archaeologists around the world consider modern-day Iraq as the cradle of civilization. Between 3500 and 1900 BC, the Tigris and Euphrates River were the home of the Sumerian people who prospered in this region. Today, when we read or seek information about the Sumer and the Anunnaki or the people that inhabited that part of the world, we come across controversial author Zecharia Sitchin. In 1976, author Sitchin published his personal translations of the Sumerian texts in a series of books called The Earth Chronicles. According to Sitchin, the clay tablets describe an alien race known as the Anunnaki, who came to Earth to mine gold. Sitchin practically suggests that extraterrestrial visited Earth in the past because their home planet needed gold to survive. Based on numerous archaeological discoveries, artifacts, records, and monuments found in the past by archaeologists and linguists, Sitchin indicates that the Anunnaki, Sumerian, those who came down from the heavens, an extremely advanced civilization from an elusive planet in our solar system, came to Earth, landing in the Persian Gulf some 432,000 years ago. This advanced civilization colonized our planet, and their sole purpose was to mine large quantities of gold. Approximately some 250,000 years ago, according to Sitchin, the ancient Anunnaki merged their alien genes with that of Homo erectus and created a species known as Homo sapiens, obtaining, as a result, a genetically bicameral species. However, humans were a hybrid species and could not procreate. Since the demand for humans as workers became greater, the ancient Anunnaki once again manipulated ancient mankind so they could reproduce on their own.
The gods instilled fear and respect. They symbolized the Sumerians' mistrust of nature. Each divinity in their pantheon played a role. Each one ruled over a city. Enlil, god of wind, ruled over air and earth in the city of Nippur. Enki, god of water and the world, was worshipped in Eridu. Udu, god of justice and truth, was worshipped in Lhasa. Inanna, known to the Babylonians as the fertility goddess Ishtar, was worshipped in Uruk. She inspired both love and war. To the Greeks, she was Aphrodite, and to the Romans, Venus. The smooth curves of this alabaster statue reflect the skill of the Sumerian artists. Their art and their religious devotion are highlighted by the statue's finish and their expressive faces.
Many wonder how it was possible for human beings to evolve so rapidly compared to other species that had already existed on our planet. Ancient peoples, through their religions, have tried to offer answers about the creation of the world and the odd creative capacity of humanity. Perhaps the answer to this dilemma can be found in the text written by what was the first organized civilization in history, the Sumerians. The Sumerian civilization emerged in Mesopotamia around 4500 BC. Over time, it was responsible for building large cities and creating the first system of writing, known as cuneiform writing, on clay tablets. During archaeological excavations in 1849 in Iraq, 14 clay tablets with Sumerian writings were found. The translation of the text revealed one of the most fantastic stories of all time, the story of the Anunnaki gods. According to the Sumerian manuscripts, there is a planet at the ends of the solar system called Nibiru. Every 3,600 years, it enters an orbit close to the planet Earth. Nibiru was the home planet of the Anunnaki, who were experiencing difficulties because the climate and atmosphere of the planet were changing rapidly, making it difficult to produce food and therefore to survive. It was necessary to use advanced methods of technology, alchemy, and magic to reverse this situation. To do so, a large amount of gold was needed, since this metal has purifying properties capable of resisting even cosmic radiation. However, gold was a rare resource in Nibiru, and without other alternatives, the Anunnaki used their advanced technology and sent ships into space in search of the precious golden metal. After a long and tiring search, they arrived on planet Earth about 445,000 years ago, where they were the first astronauts to cross space and colonize another planet. The planet Earth was inhabited only by wild animals such as mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, and some apes. The Anunnaki settled in Mesopotamia and built a wonderful city called Eridu. In this city, there was a splendorous garden full of fruit trees and animals. The garden created by the Anunnaki was named Eden, and the first favorite place of the astronaut gods. Shortly after, gold extraction began in underground mines. To do the heavy tasks, they brought with them slaves from another alien race, the Igigi. After years of forced labor and humiliation, the Igigi rebelled against the Anunnaki, giving rise to the first war on Earth. The Igigi were defeated and decimated. The Anunnaki needed new workers. The solution was to create a new race of intelligent beings, able to work, but more harmless than the Igigi. The Anunnaki combined their genes with the ancestors of human beings, creating a hybrid and submissive race at their command. The first man to emerge from this successful genetic combination was named Adamu. Compared to human beings, the Anunnaki were incredibly tall and strong, and their weapons would be more than enough to control another possible rebellion. Over time, humans developed the ability to speak and learn from the Anunnaki, to take care of plantations and build houses made of clay and stone. The Anunnaki came to like human beings. They even allowed them to live in their city and attend the sacred garden, but gave explicit orders not to reproduce too much. Against the will of the gods, human beings began to procreate quickly, which caused overpopulation in the city. Many people were expelled from Eden and Eridu, and condemned to live in exile in wildlands. After a few millennia, the planet Nibiru approached the Earth again. Nibiru's gravitational field was so strong that it adversely affected the Earth's natural conditions. There was an increase in the temperature of the planet, and the glaciers melted, rapidly raising the level of the oceans and causing constant rain. A great flood ravaged the Earth, and the city of Eridu was doomed to submerge. To save their creation, the Anunnaki created large boats that floated for days to normal water level. In this part, it is not clear whether the boats floated on the water or whether the boats were ships hovering in the sky. After their city was destroyed, the Anunnaki decided to return to Nibiru, but before they left, they gave human beings knowledge of architecture, mathematics, music, and writing. They also taught them how to establish a monarchy system, where some leaders kept their bloodline inherited for the Anunnaki pure, with the right to command others. They also ordered the construction of temples known as ziggurats, aligned with the constellations. These would one day guide the Anunnaki back to Earth. The Sumerian texts do not determine how many Anunnaki there are, but they quote some as the main ones. The most powerful deity in Sumerian mythology was An, or Anu, according to Akkadian calligraphy. Anu was the personification of heaven and possessed infinite wisdom. He was the oldest and most venerable of the gods, with sanctuaries in almost all Sumerian cities. The goddess Ki represented the earth and Anu's wife. The union between Anu and Ki gave birth to Anunnaki, a word that can be translated as children of heaven and earth. The first Anunnaki was Enlil, lord of the air, winds, storms, and responsible for keeping heaven and earth at a safe distance. Enki was the mighty god of the oceans and rivers, the patron of the city of Eridu. Later, his cult reached other peoples such as the Canaanites, Hittites, and Horites. The moon also had a ruler, Nana, worshipped as a god of wisdom and curiosity, responsible for teaching scientific and astronomical concepts to human beings. The god Utu was the personification of the sun and defender of justice, truth, and morality. Utu traveled through the heavens in his sacred carriage, emitting a brilliance capable of illuminating the world. The goddess Inanna was Utu's twin sister and goddess of fertility, war, and political power, also called the Heavenly Queen. She was one of the most cultured goddesses of Mesopotamia, adopted by Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians under the name of Ishtar. The cult of the Anunnaki was shared by many Mesopotamian peoples, adding new stories and divinities with the advancement of time, but always maintaining a very detailed essence. The history of the Anunnaki, written by the Sumerians, is full of scientific and astronomical references, very advanced for the time in which they were written. The knowledge is still one of the greatest mysteries of humanity.
George Smith, a 19th century Londoner who studied Sumerian tablets in the British Museum, deciphered some legends about devastating floods.
The wickedness of men so displeased Enlil, the supreme god, that he decided to swallow man up in a huge flood. Enki, protector of men, pleaded with him, but in vain. So Enki decided to preserve a remnant. He asked Ziusudra to build an ark and to take animals in pairs on board with him. After 6 days and nights of storm, the world was submerged. On the 7th day, the storm abated. Ziusudra released a dove that, finding no resting place, returned to him. On the 8th day, he released a raven that never returned. Mankind was saved.
Prayer was part of daily life for the Sumerians. The upkeep and ceremonies of the temple required a large body of priests and other staff, and every day the faithful brought their offerings. The archives of the city of Uruk describe the daily meal of its 4 main gods as follows: 250 loaves of bread, 1,000 tarts, 50 sheep, 8 lambs, 2 oxen, and 1 calf. Celestial food that was offered to the gods and later fed the temple's 1,200 priests and staff. The scribes recorded the hopes of the Sumerians. In exchange for their devotion, their virtue, and their respect for the established order, the Sumerians hoped for eternal life in the next world. The never-ending struggle to tame nature made them conscious of the fragility of life and inspired their most beautiful myths. Gilgamesh, the 5th king of Uruk in the 3rd millennium BC, was a historical figure. He was the Sumerians' hero, and the stories of his adventures were famous throughout Mesopotamia. They sum up the history of the Sumerian civilization. Gilgamesh was a just king and a great builder who also challenged the gods. He tamed savages, and he went to the distant forest of fragrant cedar to confront the fire-eating monster Humbaba. During their fight, Gilgamesh cut off the monster's head. He returned to Uruk in triumph. To punish him, the goddess Inanna sent the celestial bull to destroy the city. The bull dried up the meadows and rivers and opened deep crevices into which people fell to their deaths. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. The Sumerians' vision was prophetic. After ruling Mesopotamia for 3,000 years, their civilization, attacked from all sides, collapsed. The pomp of their cities was over, and so was their influence. The irrigation canals gradually dried up. The walls of the houses collapsed. The temples themselves collapsed under the combined assault of the sun, the rain, and the wind. The clay of the bricks turned to dust, leaving only a shapeless mass above the dunes, the last vestiges of a civilization's grandeur.
Ancient Sumeria. According to mainstream scholars, this is the birthplace of civilization as we know it, the birthplace of religion, the first science, the first war, and the first written word. Now all that is left is a message buried beneath the sand.
It's one of Iraq's most famous archaeological sites, rising from the desert near Nasiriyah in the southeast, the Ziggurat of Ur, a massive 4,000-year-old temple pyramid, and the surrounding ruins of an ancient Sumerian city.
Archaeologists and scholars have been piecing evidence together for centuries in this area of the world, hoping to prove the biblical stories of the Garden of Eden.
Most people think, well, we're interested in the Middle East because of the oil, and there's a lot of truth to that. But at the same time, you're going to find people who are very interested in these different esoteric philosophies, like the Freemasons in government, the Christians in government. All of these people have long had a strong interest and also believe that there may be some kind of power or some sort of connection there, that if you make it, it empowers you in some way.
What kind of power could these groups have if they could prove how humanity started? The search for something more powerful than our own current reality isn't a modern concept, but rather an ongoing search for the location of the Garden of Eden, the proverbial beginning.
There's been a fixation amongst biblical scholars, early archaeologists, that everything in the Middle East began on the Euphrates and the Tigris, down in what is today Lower Iraq. And that this is where the Garden of Eden was. This was where everything emerged, good and bad, in the sort of Genesis tradition.
In 1922, English archaeologist C. Leonard Woolley went to southern Iraq to hopefully find the Garden of Eden, based on early discoveries of Sumerian cuneiforms. However, what he actually uncovered instead was the exact location of the ancient Sumerian city of Ur. Was he getting close?
The early archaeologists were trying to prove the Bible, and they were funded by biblical societies. And that's, in other words, they had to come up with the proof, and it ignored a lot of legends and traditions which suggested that these cities were elsewhere.
Could Woolley have ignored some important information that was revealed several years before? In 1849, almost 75 years earlier, thousands of Sumerian cuneiforms were found northwest of Ur, at the ancient cities of Sippar and Nippur.
In 1849, Henry Layard performed many excavations on the Sippar site and discovered about 20,000 tablets, Sumerian and Akkadian. And amongst all the tablets discovered, about a dozen of them are about the Garden of Eden.
Could this be the location of the Garden of Eden? Or was this just another clue leading researchers to another location?
Subsequent cultures, whether the Assyrians, whether the Babylonians, who rose to prominence in that area, who were not Sumerians, nevertheless venerated and highly valued everything that the Sumerians did. And that's why we can read the Sumerian language, because those later cultures made a project of taking Sumerian texts and translating them into their language. And those are languages that the scholars could read because they were Semitic languages. They belonged to a language family where the code could be cracked, whereas Sumerian was an isolate. And without those translations done by later cultures who nevertheless had contact with Sumer, we would not be able to read those Sumerian texts at all.
Were these later cultures able to decipher the beginning of humanity? Sumero-Akkadian researcher and author of 8 books regarding Sumerian translation, Anton Parks, believes that for hundreds of years, we have been translating these tablets wrong.
Gary Zeitlin, qui est scientifique, qui a travaillé. Gary Zeitlin, who is a scientist who worked on the SETI project for many years and collaborated with NASA, he was very interested in the Sumerian translations, and he provided me with these 10 tablets found at Sippar to check symbols one by one. I noticed one translation saying one thing, and the other saying sometimes the complete opposite. The two translations did not comply. I persistently did research on Hebrew, but nothing was coming out of it. And then completely by chance, I came across a Sumero-Akkadian lexicon, and this is when I could finally, slowly start to translate the tablets.
What Anton Parks began to translate was a completely different version of the Garden of Eden than we've heard before. Not only had the words been mistranslated, the actual location had been overlooked.
In biblical text, we constantly read about this idea of heaven or paradise. This comes from the Greek paradisios, and this literally means enclosure for wild animals. Not paradise, a term that was later transcribed as garden during the Hellenistic era. If we go back to the original translation in the Sumerian tablets, it says, "The men who serve the gods work for them in the garden and are treated like animals." It is a very clear and recurrent theme. They are slaves who serve the divine community. In Hebraic texts, we understand that the humans seem happy in this so-called paradise, which is, in fact, more like a concentration camp, according to Sumerian texts. In my translations, we also discovered the word Karsag, which translated to City of the Gods. It's interesting that all the highest points in Turkey are named Karadağ, which strangely resembles Karsag.
Karadağ translates to Black Mountain, and also refers to the highest mountains in Turkey. The only summit with the name Karadağ that is close to the Mesopotamian plain and tributary of the Tigris, and only a few kilometers from the Euphrates, stands 29 kilometers south of the city Sirt and 19 kilometers southwest of the city of Ur. Is this the paradise described in the Sumerian text?
Jerry sent me images of this site from Google Earth. And at the back, on the mountainside, there is a little plain. This is where I think the Garden of Eden of the gods was located based on my translation of the text.
The Garden of Eden was where the 4 rivers emerged from, 2 of which are easily identified as the Euphrates and the Tigris, which do indeed obviously flow through modern Iraq and empty out into the Arabian Sea. But they rise in southeast Turkey. And the other 2 rivers can be identified as rivers that also rise in southeast to eastern Turkey. All of these rivers emerge in the same general part of the world, which we know today as either eastern or southeastern Turkey.
With the decoding of the Sumerian cuneiforms and the location of these 4 rivers, could this be the actual location for the Garden of Eden? The closest paved road to the proposed location is Highway 5651. As easy as it may seem to get to this location to excavate, scholars and archaeologists consider this area highly politically unstable, and it has remained untouched. All we have at the moment is the language to decode from the Sumerian cuneiforms, the cuneiforms that describe a different kind of paradise. These 10 tablets, according to Anton Parks, tell the Sumerian version of how the Garden of Eden was created.
Lorsque les dieux sumériens sont arrivés sur Terre, ils se sont établis sur cette...
From my translations, I discovered when the Sumerian gods arrived on Earth, they settled on this mountain in order to create a colony and be able to survive. Apparently, they suffered damage and ended up on this mountain because of a war, and they found shelter. Many experts believe that they came from the Pleiades star cluster. My opinion is that they came from there. Maybe the war broke out around there. But I really believe that this is where the Anunnaki were created. During this conflict, on one side you have a matriarchal regime, and on the other side, a patriarchal one, with all these new gods. There are conflicts in space, those new landscapes, like it says on the genealogy of the land tablet. These gods are going to change the way life gets implanted on Earth. The gods are going to create new conditions for life to bloom, for their colony to thrive.
But who are these gods that hope to make Earth their home?
The Epic of Atrahasis and others, they talk about that the Earth was actually administered by a conference of gods or a group of gods in an assembly. It wasn't just one god. Yeah, they would have like their equivalent of the prime minister or the CEO who would be in charge of this group. Enlil, Enki, that were the primary members of this Congress there.
Well, Enki and Enlil in the Sumerian system are an interesting pair. Enlil is this rather sort of overarching, domineering, angry, dangerous entity. And he doesn't really care about humanity. Humanity are not very important to him. But then we have Enki, the trickster, and the god of wisdom, actually. And he does care about humanity. And he intervenes on the human level.
They are called gods, but they were humanoid beings of a rather reptilian type. The text of Eden that I translated depict clearly and quite frequently the reptilian features of the gods. I personally estimate that the gods arrived approximately 300,000 years ago. And this derives from the fact that Homo sapiens arrived shortly after. I say this because throughout the text, genetics and the transformation of the human being are recurrent themes. The two particles that compose the word Eden are E, which means home, and Din, or Tin, which is life. But indeed, they are not alone. Humans are already on Earth. Who are these human beings?
If the Sumerian gods realized that they were not alone, what might have been their interaction with these kinds of humans?
What can be noted in the Sumerian tablets, when they clearly speak of creating workers to serve the Anunnas, the main geneticist is always Enki. He works with the genome that is on the planet to create a new kind of human. He is usually helped by priestesses that we often call the Nintis, who are the priestesses of life. They know how to clone with him. He can change the human genomes according to what Enlil asks of him, which would be left-brained, well-disciplined humans.
When we look at the Sumerian tradition, it is a group of beings rather than one being that creates humankind. So it is not a single creator, but a group of intelligent, technologically advanced beings. Where the Sumerian creation varies from the Christian traditions, for example, and some of the native traditions, is in the Sumerian traditions, humankind began with the sacrifice of the life of an advanced being, of a god from Sumeria, so that that god's DNA, or the blood is what the texts say, could be mixed with the elements of the earth to create the first viable human.
These are the people who have the knowledge to clone. They can clone themselves and then humans. In the text, it says they take the genes from their opponents, who they consider inferior, who they name as Kingu. They use their blood, and they will go on to create the new human who is going to serve them with these genes.
Researchers like Greg Braden stumbled across some research that has connected the Sumerian translations to an actual genetic change in our chromosomes.
Shedding new light on these creation stories is with the mystery of human chromosome number 2. Human chromosome number 2 is the second largest chromosome in the human body. It forms about 8% of DNA in every cell. And what makes it such a mystery is that it appears to be the result of an ancient fusion of pre-existing chromosomes from primates that have been fused in a very precise way, and the fusion site has been modified and stabilized so that human chromosome number 2 is optimized for us today. This has happened in a way that cannot be explained by evolution as we know it today. Now, why is this important? Human chromosome number 2 contains the genes that largely set us apart from all other forms of life. The cortex of the human brain that gives us the ability for things like logic, empathy, sympathy, compassion, the ability to consciously trigger conscious states of self-healing within our bodies. These are possible because of what has happened with human chromosome number 2.
Could chromosome number 2 be the work of a master geneticist, otherwise known as Enki from the Sumerian text?
Justement, à tout moment, il peut aussi clandestinement changer le code humain pour...
It is said that Enki secretly modifies the human genes by group or by location and imbues some humans with a knowledge that is different, to the point where the other gods turn against him. His experiment will change the human genes to enlighten mankind. And throughout this cloning process that the Anunnaki and Enlil are overlooking, I think that some humans filter through all of this and start becoming independent.
Anton Parks points out that this is something that the gods did not expect from these new humans, that keeps appearing in the ancient texts, and that is the human ability to be more than just slaves. This forms a division of the gods, a division that causes a war that has set the tone for humanity today.
There are certain very interesting parallels with the story of the Sumerian origin of modern humanity and what we see in modern dialogues about AI.
Humans fancy that there's something special about the way we perceive the world, and yet we live in loops as tight and as closed as the hosts do. Seldom questioning our choices, content for the most part to be told what to do next.
We now have the rebooted Westworld, in which something that originated as the idea of a robotic consciousness turns into essentially a flesh and blood creation, which is then infused with a consciousness, thus asking the question, if they can reproduce, if they are self-aware, is this not the next level of humanity?
An interesting and very important name in the biblical text and the Sumerian text is the word Adam from the Garden of Eden. Extensive tests have been conducted to see where this word came from, consistently looking for Hebrew roots, but it is a Sumerian word which means animals. Again, we understand that human beings were considered to be animals by the Sumerian gods, and this is where lies the conflict between two gods, Enki and Enlil. Enki wants to treat them like the other gods.
These two Sumerian gods have a conflict over the use of humans, and it is to be the root of the biblical story of the serpent in the garden. As the story unravels, the riddle starts with the origin of the word Satan, or Satan in English.
Satan in Sumerian means the administrator. For years, everybody has been looking to find where this word came from. Books revolve around this issue. It is a Sumerian term. I don't understand how nobody saw it. It is very clear. We find it in ancient lexicons. Enlil is often referred to as the Great Satan, the Master Administrator. In the Sumerian text, Enlil systematically asked Enki to go negotiate and talk with humans. He is always the one to deal with them. Remember, he is a humanoid with reptilian features. And in Sumerian tablets, he is always, or very often, called the serpent, just like in the Bible. He is the only one that the humans are going to see. And when they see him, they see a serpent-like humanoid. I reckon this is why he is called the serpent in the garden. He is a friend of the humans.
In the biblical text, the serpent tempts Eve with an apple from the forbidden tree of knowledge. Yahweh, or God, from the Bible, forbids the humans in the garden to partake from this tree. According to Parks, the Sumerian version of this story translates Yahweh, or the biblical God, into the great Satan, which according to Sumerian text is Enlil, and the serpent in the garden as Enki, who has become a friend of the humans.
It is interesting to wonder why the serpent in Sumerian text, just like in the Bible, comes to the woman. I think there are two reasons. The first one is that I think the woman was more accessible and available when she was in the garden. Therefore, he was more often around women who were collecting food for the colony. The second reason is that I think women are the future of mankind. They raise their children, they transmit their knowledge to their children. Enki is going to tell the women the secret of tool making. This is expressed as niche in Sumerian, which means tree. This means for the first time mankind could have two sides of the tool. The side is fundamentally good so that they can take care of themselves, and the tool that is fundamentally bad, which they could use to defend themselves. One could wonder why Enki insists on getting this particular secret through to the humans. Well, he has the desire to set them free.
If indeed the knowledge that Enki portrays to the humans is a tool, is this an actual ancient weapon that some believe certain organizations are looking for? Or is this Enki teaching the humans about the infinite abilities they possess through their DNA?
There's a spectacular scene where humans take up arms and go up the mountain of the gods to revolt, and even maybe try to kill all the gods. What happens is an abomination. They put back on track the few survivors. Indeed, from what we can grasp from his personality, Enki was all about peace and wouldn't use tools in order to kill, as he was perfectly aware of what would happen. So this scene of humans rebelling against the gods is quite special, and it cannot be found anywhere in the Bible. Each time I see the first movie of the Planet of the Apes, it makes me think of this story. Let's put this back into context. Replace the apes with reptilian gods, and you have the exact same story. It is the exact same story. It stayed somewhere in our brain, and this is why we can find similar elements in movies. We can find similarities as well in human behavior.
Could this situation be the biblical fall of man? Some scholars, like Graham Hancock, believe that free will to decide was the real purpose of Enki's intervention.
We are here at this plane, at this level of existence, to learn the lessons of duality, to make choices between good and evil. And it's very clear in the ancient Egyptian system that those choices were important and that they would define us ultimately and set out the route map for our immortal destiny in a way. I would say that in Enki and Enlil we are looking at a dualistic pair. And what's interesting about that dualism is its intense focus on the future of humanity, on what happens to us. That matters to Enki. It doesn't matter to Enlil. The Sumerian problem is that we don't know where the Sumerians came from or who they were, their language. I mean, we have endless Sumerian artifacts and endless Sumerian tablets, but their language is actually not related structurally to any other known language family. It's completely isolated and unique.
But could the Sumerian problem have been a way for Yahweh to install his own rules so the humans would not revolt again? Is this why we don't find any of these translations anywhere else, and why we have the establishment and religious beliefs surrounding our existence today?
Finalement, la Genèse, c'est pas si clair que ça qu'elle aurait été
The book of Genesis was really written between 200 and 300 BC. It is important to know that the Bible, where we find the most complete book of Genesis, is dated from 400 AC, which brings us to this idea, that when scholars are compiling the book of Genesis, they must have made a choice. A deliberate choice to keep or take out some elements in order to make the Bible as we know it today.
Is it possible that modern-day religion and government structure have been mistranslating our human past to keep us under the control of Enlil or Yahweh? Experts like Billy Carson still believe that the knowledge from these gods were able to further our human imprint on this planet.
When you look into the ancient Sumerian tablets, they talk about these gods that came here to Earth and basically rose them to a high level of civilization and taught them everything that they know. Now, these gods didn't do the labor themselves, but they imparted this wisdom and information onto the humans that actually did the labor.
Could these gods have created us in their likeness? Was the Garden of Eden the beginning for not only the gods' reign on earth, but also humans? And could the constant search for the Garden of Eden be a programmed loop we hope to understand?
The symbolism is very important in our sense of ourselves collectively and personally. There is something lost. We don't know quite what it is, but the story suggests it's the lost connection with the transcendence. And so we wish we could go back, not only to the Garden of Eden, but in other ways, go back to some earlier time. Nothing is more significant in the received wisdom than the story of the garden.
At the end of the 3rd millennium BC, the great Sumerian civilization came to an abrupt end. Its sudden demise was bewailed in numerous lamentation texts that have been discovered by archaeologists. The texts described the calamity to an evil wind that came blowing from the west, from the direction of the Mediterranean Sea, a deathly cloud that caused excruciating death to all living beings, people and animals alike, that withered plants and poisoned the waters. In the Wars of Gods and Men, 3rd book of the Earth Chronicles series, Zechariah Sitchin saw an explanation of the sudden death in a long text known to scholars as the erectus, that described a chain of events that ultimately led to the use of weapons of terror and a conflict between opposing clans of the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. Based on the descriptions of the weapons in the erectus and in the lamentation text, Zechariah Sitchin concluded that the weapons of terror were nuclear weapons, used to obliterate the spaceport that then existed in the Sinai Peninsula and some sinning cities such as Sodom and Gomorrah. The nuclear cloud then was carried by the prevailing winds eastward, causing death and desolation in the lands between the rivers, Mesopotamia, the empire of Sumer and Akkad. Besides claiming that nuclear weapons were first used on Earth not in the 1940s in Hiroshima but thousands of years earlier in the Near East, Zechariah also pinpointed a date, 2024 BC.
In October 2016, the American Society of Human Genetics held its annual meeting, and the conclusions they reached were nothing short of astounding. The data they collected shows that people in Melanesia, an area in the South Pacific that surrounds Papua New Guinea and its neighboring islands, may be carrying some unknown genes in their DNA. Geneticists believe that unrecognized DNA belongs to a previously unknown species of humanoids. According to Ryan Bollender, one of the researchers involved in the study, the species is not Neanderthal or Denisovan, but something different. We are losing a population, or we are misinterpreting something about relationships, he said. Denisovans represent an extinct species belonging to the hominid genus. They were named after the discovery in the cave of Denisova in the Siberian mountains of Altai, where the first fragment of the bone that belonged to this species was found. Little is known about this enigmatic cousin of ours. While about the people of Melanesia is not known much for the moment. Human history is much more complicated than we thought, Bollender said. Dark-skinned Melanesian tribe with natural blonde hair. For a long time, it was believed that only the Caucasians had blonde hair. It was not until 1756 that Charles de Brosses wrote about an old black race in the Pacific defeated by a people called Polynesia, and in 1832 when Jules Dumont d'Urville wrote about the same race and their unique hair color that the world became aware of the people called Melanesians in the Melanesia Islands. But piece by piece, the complex past of humanity is brought to light. And discoveries like this seem to point in one direction: we could not be who we think we are. With assumptions about population size and the most recent dates of population separation taken from literature, we estimate the date of archaic modern separation at 440,000 plus or minus 300 years ago for all modern human populations. If that number does not ring any bell, reiterate the Anunnaki hypothesis. According to the history of Genesis, the 12th planet, known as Nibiru, was populated by humanoids very similar to human. After they encountered a severe problem in the atmosphere, they went on a quest through the solar system to find gold, a unique and significant metal that could heal their planet. When Nibiru approached Earth's orbit, approximately 432,000 years before Christ, the Nibiruans used spacecraft to send people and essential goods from their planet to Earth. After reaching the surface, the advanced beings established bases in ancient Mesopotamia. Many believe that this is the true reason of the creation of humanity within the laboratories of the Anunnaki geneticists. And this recent study and many more findings confirm this hypothesis almost daily. It offers a vision that could answer one of our oldest and most important questions: who are we? To obtain the irrefutable solution to this secular enigma, we must dig deeply where no one has explored before. But this is harder to say than to do. Another way to do this would be to analyze the hidden microscopic records inside each of us. The Anunnaki knew that their DNA was the key to the engineering of the ideal slave. In our endless search for our true lineage, we must do the same as human beings. In a recent effort, another group of scientists came to a similar conclusion. Led by evolutionary geneticist Eske Willerslev of the Natural History Museum in Denmark, scientists examined DNA samples taken from 83 Aboriginal Australians. They also tested 25 participants from native highland populations of Papua New Guinea. To their surprise, the researchers discovered exotic DNA, similar to Denisovan in the genomes of study volunteers. Keep in mind, the researchers only called it identical to the Denisovan. Still, the group that seeded their genes to the participants' ancestors is entirely unknown. Who this group is, we do not know, Willerslev said. Neither do we, but a particular crowd comes to mind. Not surprisingly, such discoveries are always made when studying the genome of remote populations. Over the ages, these isolated groups had little contact with the outside world. They lived and procreated within closed communities, and this is reflected in their genome. The richer and more diverse your ancestry, the less likely it is that particular genes will remain unchanged. In the say of the Australian and Melanesian Aborigines, isolation means that fewer genes were altered throughout their existence. It is not difficult to imagine this alternative version of our past. The Anunnaki come to Earth, play God, and create humanity. Chief Scientist Enki and Chief Medical Officer Ninti use genetic manipulation and in vitro fertilization to create human beings in their image. They use society to serve their purposes, and when it suits them, they dispense destruction in the form of a flood of biblical proportions, a part of history suppressed under conspiracy. Then, some chosen human beings are protected by a faction of the Anunnaki who decided to go against the protocol. They survive and spread in every corner of the globe. Thousands of generations pass, and the genomes of those who socialize more mingle beyond recognition. But in some places, the flame of the creators still burns.